Uh, I am Mike Mikowski. I'm the president and CEO of Ginza. Thank you very much for joining us on the Cartel Strikes Back. You know, OPEC meetings usually get some news. This particular meeting, which is an OPEC Plus, includes Russia, has particularly gotten, I think, a lot of attention, not just in the oil market and the energy market, which their meetings always do, has attracted, I would say, unusual attention in the mainstream press and among politicians in the policy community. They raised, we're going to get into the details, but they decided to agree to a cut of production of 2 million barrels a day. We're going to explain what that means. But also it was seen by some on the right of center, I would say. The right side of the aisle is a rebuke to, well, I'd say by both the left and the right politically, as a rebuke to President Biden. The administration tried to, lobbied against this cut. President Biden went to Saudi Arabia earlier in the summer, clearly about oil production being one of the topics. Some see it as also reflecting a criticism, a failure of the Biden energy policy. Those on the left have seen this as also a poke in the eye to the administration, and the left has often been critical of Saudi Arabia in any case, and this has reinforced their views. So let's delve into a lot of the details. What was behind it? We have a really interesting group of speakers. I'm going to, Larry Goldstein is the former president and co-founder of the Petroleum Industry Research Foundation, PEER Inc. He also was president and co-founder of PIRA, Petroleum Industry Research Associates. He is currently a trustee with the Energy Policy Research Foundation, EPRINC. He's also a member of Ginza's Iran Policy Project, and in all full disclosure, he also is my mentor in the energy industry. I worked for him when I was in business school, and he's one of the leading, he has been for many decades, one of the leading energy experts in the United States. And Larry, it's really an honor to have you. Also, we have Professor Bernard Heikel. He is the professor of Near Eastern Studies and the director of the Institute for Trans-Regional Study of the Contemporary Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia at Princeton University. Professor, that's some business card you must have. So then we also have John Hanna, the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow here at Ginza. So great to have you all. Larry, I'm going to start with you. Before we get into the why, let's just explain what the what here is. The headline number is 2 million barrels a day cut, but I think you and some others in the energy industry have said the actual cut, the effective cut, it might be closer to 1 million barrels. You want to explain what this means for the oil market first?
Yes, first of all, it's not a production cut. It's a voluntary quota cut. Okay. And many of the countries, including Russia's production is well below those current quotas, which means they will not have to cut 1 barrel to comply with this new agreement. Unfortunately, the media and the administration are couching what the Saudis did in purely political terms, as if this was designed as a move against the United States. I don't believe it was. The administration is playing in the context of the midterms and the single-minded focus on gasoline prices. You'll see that probably in their response to probably tap the SPR one more time. But what the Saudis did, they had needed to do since mid-August. In mid-August, we put out several notes suggesting that we would be seeing a major cut in OPEC production at the beginning of the new year. Why? Because when you look at the supply-demand balances from a fundamental perspective, stocks which had been declining every month this year, would start to build by at least 1 million to 1.5 million barrels a day, putting downward pressure on price. OPEC had forecasted 3 million barrel a day growth in demand. Our demand forecast is 2 million. The Saudis are closer to our forecast than their own organization, and they were going to cut. The problem was the cut was going to come later rather than sooner. What expedited the timing of the cut and the size of the cut was the obstinance and unwillingness of the US government and the EU to reconsider a very risky proposal on a cap on Russian oil prices. Many people read that, they see it in the Times, in the Wall Street Journal, and they hear it in the financial community, and they kind of dismiss it. But what does a cap on Russian oil prices really mean? For the first time, it means a buyer's cartel would be forming, telling a producer what it can do, what it can't do, and what it could get for its price. We've had extensive conversation at a very serious level with the Saudis around this issue. They've been trying as hard as they can to get the attention of the administration on this and have failed every time they've tried. What it means to them is that if this buyer's cartel, and the EU and the US have been meeting as recently as this week on the implementation of the cap on Russian oil prices, is successful, then the Saudis are asking themselves, if they can do this to Russia, who's next? And the Saudis do not want to see a successful buyer's cartel where they will be the second target in mind. So what they did was they speeded up the time frame in which they were talking about a cut. The cut is actually closer to 1 million barrels a day or less than the 2 million, because as I said, most of the countries listed there won't have to comply because their actual production is lower than the quota. Only the Saudis, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iraq might actually step up. And if you go to the OPEC communique, what you see is they're not talking about this as a production cut or a quota cut. They're calling it a voluntary cut. They're trying to get their act in line as to what they need to be doing as you move into 2023. What should be the appropriate quota targets? What should be the new baseline? And what should be the production targets in line? The Saudis have agreed to cut production by 526,000 barrels a day from the 11 million. We believe by and large, not in November, it's too early. The companies are already there nominating for the November liftings. It's too early for the Saudis to fully implement that size cut in November. Well, but we believe they will do that in December, and they will follow through on their promise. We believe Kuwait will probably follow through. That's about 700,000 barrels a day. Iraq and the UAE will comply to some degree, and you can't count on anyone else. The Russians will not have to cut 1 barrel, which is why they were very comfortable going along, because their actual production is substantially below the quota. But the principal thing is we're overreacting. We're now talking about all the things we have to do to get back at the Saudis. What we don't understand, the US has a handful of allies and a lot of countries with commonalities of interest. We have commonalities of interest with the Germans, for example, but we don't agree on everything. We have commonalities of interest that are very important with Saudi Arabia, but we don't agree on everything. The Saudis are an oil producer. We are still, by and large, an oil consumer, and our understandings conflict with one another there. The Saudis do care about price. They do care about supply and demand. They want to be a reliable supplier, but they do not want to be dictated to by a cartel or any buyer as to what they can do, what they should do, and how they should price their oil. They reacted to the Janet Yellen proposal of this price cap. And unfortunately, and we've had some conversation with people in government, They're not happy with my interpretation of things, but I believe at the end of the day, our policy has pushed the Saudis even closer, and they are very close with the Russians, but they pushed them even closer than they needed to be with this continuing, mindless, very risky concept of a price cap on Russian oil. I'll stop there.
Well, that's a lot to unpack, Larry. Let me just ask you a few quick follow-ups just to give context to the audience. Overall global production and demand today of oil is what would you say?
Demand is running just shy of 100 million barrels a day. Supply in 21 was just fractionally below that. We have drawing stocks every month, but at the turn of 2023, stocks were going to build. And it's very interesting because if you really study the market in detail, country by country, you see something very interesting. Prior to February 24th, at the beginning of the year, Chinese oil demand was forecasted to grow 500,000 barrels a day. China oil demand, because of their COVID problems and their lockdowns, will probably decline 300,000 to 400,000 barrels a day. So we're seeing a swing in demand just in China alone of 900,000 barrels a day. This was not lost on the Saudis. We're seeing a lower decline in demand in the United States from initially the EIA forecasting 600,000 barrel a day growth to now 300,000 barrel a day growth. Gasoline demand in the second half of the year, we've been forecasting will decline 6%, despite the fact that it grew the first half of the year. So far in July, August, and September data totally supports our 6% decline. Demand is coming off. Diesel demand is a suspect product. Its demand is growing where you can substitute very high priced natural gas in Europe. It's declining everywhere else. So the Saudis are very sensitive to watching the decline in demand continuing to occur. And they were looking to cut production in any case by 1 million barrels a day. The 2 million cut that they talked about really interprets to 1 million barrels a day or less. So it's identical. What they did was they speeded up the time frame and they got the attention of the administration because of the timing of when the administration and the EU is going to make a final decision on the price cap on Russian oil. That decision is going to be made over the next couple of weeks. And the Saudis are paranoid about that.
Two other points, and I'll move on to the other speakers. But let me just ask you one other couple of data points on. So you mentioned, we talked about supply and demand. Prices have peaked about what amount this year, and how far down were they recently?
Because of the misinformation, and I believe some of it deliberate, following February 24th, there was story after story after story that Russian oil production and exports were declining 1.5 million to 2 million barrels a day. Ed Morse from Citibank was the only calming analyst around who basically said, I hear what you're saying, but I don't see what you're saying. And he was right. What is very interesting, the US can try to push the increase in gasoline prices between February 24th and September on OPEC, on the US producer, on the gasoline refiner, on the gasoline retailer, on Russia. But ironically, up until this past month, Russian production of oil has hardly changed. It's off about 600,000 barrels a day. So if that's all you lost, you can't pin the big increase in gasoline prices on Russia. You can pin the food prices on them, the agricultural prices, the fertilizer on them, the neon, the problem with chips because of the neon. All of those things are Russia-led in terms of inflation, but not gasoline. Gasoline prices in the US were up $1 before February 24th, and inflation was already up 7% before February 24th. So while a lot can be pinned on Russia right now, gasoline prices are not one of those issues.
Yeah, but also just to clarify on oil prices, they recently went to, I think, the high 70s. Is that right? And they
now they went down to
that's what I meant. They went down
to 76, and now they're close to 90.
From a recent peak of
they were in the 120s in late February, March because of the fear that we had already lost 1.5 million to 2 million barrels of Russian production, which we didn't. We will start to lose Russian oil, but we have not really lost it in size up till now. What you've seen is a diversion of about 1.5 million to 2 million barrels from the West to Asia. The Russians are discounting their oil there by about $25 a barrel. They're absorbing much higher transportation costs, but they're having no trouble selling primarily to India and China. China was importing about 900,000 barrels a day of Russian oil before February 24th. They're about 1.7 million now. India, about 100,000 barrels a day. They're over 1 million because of the big discount. And one of the problems the US might have on trying to implement the cap on Russian oil is to get the Indians and the Chinese to go along. The Indians have said, hey, we're not buying Russian oil. We're buying cheap priced oil. And my sense is people will do what's in their self-interest. And the Indians will probably continue to want to buy Russian oil.
Larry, thank you for that data-packed answer. That was, we'll come back on that, but that was, I think, extremely helpful. Professor Eichel, why don't, Larry just said this really wasn't directed at the Biden administration's policy to the region, but that seems to be how, at least it's being taken here. How do you respond to what Larry said? What's your thoughts about what the implications are for U.S. policy?
So, before I begin, let me just say that what you just heard from Larry Goldstein is pure gold. I mean, the man is a master of his subject, and every word he said is absolutely true. And I agree with him. So, and I'm not just saying this to flatter him. Now, let me give you what I will provide is really a set of footnotes and maybe a bit of color to what he already mentioned. First, I absolutely agree that the Saudis were very disturbed by the idea and the project of setting price caps on Russian oil and having a buyer's cartel form. That's absolutely correct. And in the many conversations I've had with the Saudi oil minister, Prince Abdulaziz, he repeated this issue, all the time. He was talking about it in the press all the time. So there was no secret about how the Saudis felt. I think the second issue that bothered the Saudis, and this is something that Larry did not mention, is the use by the United States, by Biden, of the SPR as an instrument to bring down the price of oil, and not as an instrument for dealing with emergencies. And I'm not an expert here, and Larry can correct me, but I'm not aware of another administration that has used it as extensively, with some 200 million barrels now having been, used. And effectively what we see in the present cut, which is closer to 900,000, this most recent OPEC plus cut, is an offset of what the Americans have been doing with 1 million barrels a day from the SPR. And that's one way to think about it. The third point I would make, so other than price caps and their reaction, the SPR, is that the Saudis, have been dealing with the Biden administration really from last September, I think, when Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, went to Saudi Arabia and begged the Saudis to increase production with an eye to the November elections. So this is a year before the coming elections. The Biden administration was pushing for lower oil prices. And more recently, and I can tell you this because I know, people in the Biden administration, not just the Treasury Secretary, but people like Amos Hochstein and others, Brett McGurk, were calling all the Gulf states, ministers, but also oil company executives, and threatening them. So, the conversation went something like this. Please don't cut before the elections and do whatever you want after the elections. If you don't cut, we will buy 200 million barrels of oil at $75 from all of you. So in fact, the United States was saying we're going to set the price at 75 and buy back the 200 million barrels to replenish the SPR. which is kind of, I mean, just a little footnote on the SPR. I mean, it is insane to produce, to use that oil, and then to buy it at a relatively high price, right? You would want to buy the SPR like the Chinese are doing at a discount, you know, if you can, or as cheaply as possible. Anyway, that's just a little aside. But people like Amos were calling and essentially both trying to cajole and to threaten. And the threat came in the form of, if you cut, we will not veto NOPEC. Congress will go after you. So it's very clear that the Biden administration is really only concerned about one thing, and that's the election, and not really any other consideration that the Saudis may see. The other thing that the Saudis are experiencing with the Americans is that with the war in Ukraine, a lot of the weaponry that was promised to Saudi Arabia, and which the Saudis are paying top dollar for, is not coming to Saudi Arabia. It's going to Ukraine. So they haven't been receiving the weapon systems that they've asked for example, defend themselves against a possible Iranian attack, which happened in September 2019, or the Houthi attacks from Yemen. And then there's a reading of the markets by Saudi Arabia of where demand and supply is and what they need to do. And then they have their own fiscal and budgetary considerations to take into account as to where they would like oil to be, which, you know, Larry talked about as well. So I don't see the Saudis as having done this as either a move to get closer to the Russians. For them, the relationship with Russia is a transactional one. It worked really well when shale oil was eating into their market share, both of their countries' market share, as well as bringing the price down. And it's not directed at Biden either, because it's determined by sort of a national security and consideration and calculation that's been made at the highest level in Saudi Arabia. And I would add, in coordination with the United Arab Emirates and the Kuwaitis. Kuwaitis don't hate the United States. You know, the Kuwaitis are very strong allies of the United States. We have 25,000 troops in Kuwait. And for the Kuwaitis to go along with this tells you something, that it's really about markets, and it's about a reading of the energy world, and it's not about a particular administration or the elections. You know, I can add a lot more color if you want, but that's what I would say.
Michael, if I can just quickly.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask about the SPR. All right, go ahead.
On the SPR.
Yeah,
some of you might be interested that Petroleum Industry Research Foundation, my mentor, John Lichtblau, was very close to a senator from Washington State, Henry Jackson, who was the chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, a Democrat. In 1971, John and I went to Washington to meet with him. U.S. production had stagnated. U.S. demand was growing 5% a year. Our growing dependency on the Middle East, we felt, would create down the road some vulnerability to a disruption. And we convinced Jackson to take a look at putting oil in these salt caverns at the Gulf Coast. Jackson loved the idea, but it took an Arab embargo of 73, which none of us foresaw coming, plus 2 more years, 75, before that happened. Now, the purpose of the SPR, because we were intimately involved in the legislation, EPCA, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, the purpose of the SPR was to minimize economic dislocations during legitimate supply disruptions, not to dampen gasoline prices. We have had a total misuse of the concept. And ironically, and I didn't get into this because it's a minor point, one of the things the Saudis said to us in our conversation is that they're concerned that they can't foresee what's going to happen over the next 12 months. What will happen with Russia? What will happen with Iraq, Nigeria, Libya, Iran? They don't know about the supply disruptions that can and are occurring, how that might affect things. Will China recover and come back with a vengeance on demand? So they are very concerned about the lack of spare capacity. So by cutting now, they build a little bit of a cushion to be able to respond if any of those events were to occur. The irony is they're building a little bit of a cushion to respond to an emergency. We're drawing down our tool to respond to an emergency.
Can I just add a small footnote to this? So this, you're muted, Michael.
All right, sorry. I want to get to John in a second, so hold on one second. But Larry, just to finish that point, after this cut, this voluntary cut by the Saudis, what would their spare production capacity be, you think? Their sustainable production?
They are
spare capacity.
claiming, and no one could refute it, that they can produce on a sustained basis, given 3 months time to get up 12 million barrels a day. They've never been tested on that number. We don't believe it. We do not know it. I want to be absolutely clear. We do not know it. We know the data. We know our conversations informally with some of the people over there who won't go on the record, but the official public statement, which they put in their SEC filings, which therefore you have to take seriously when they went public to sell shares, is 12 million barrels a day. So under this cut, if they adhere to it, they would be at 10 million rounded 500,000. That would give them 1.5 million barrels of spare capacity compared to about 1 million now.
Okay, let me go to John. John, what do you have to, so Larry is saying, and the Professor Heichel is also kind of echoing that this isn't necessarily directed at the Biden administration. No, this seems to be the way many are taking it. And I don't know if the reality, the perception is more important than the reality. If Larry is right and the Professor Heichel is correct, how do you see the implications of this? Because it certainly has gotten a lot of attention here in Washington.
Yeah, no, it has, Mike. And, you know, whatever the administration was threatening or cajoling the Saudis with, I think was an accurate reading of what the reaction would be to a significant decision announcement on production cuts. That it has created a genuine firestorm here that I think is only going to supercharge a really destructive and dangerous cycle in the U.S.-Saudi relationship that already was in, as we all know, a fair degree of trouble. I think there was some hope that through the visit in July, the president and the administration had decided to recalibrate and change course. They saw the importance of Saudi Arabia, not just in any energy markets, but in helping to stabilize the Middle East as we go into a period of an era of great power competition. That obviously didn't happen. Nobody seemed to have been convinced by the trip and any genuine conversion of the Biden administration to really fully appreciating the importance of the U.S.-Saudi strategic relationship and the importance of the Middle East, a stable and secure Middle East to American national interests. I don't. So that's the perception, and Congress is now off to the races, and that was quite predictable. And I think it's very, very unfortunate whether the Saudis intended it or not. I don't know how much they brought that into their calculations, but I don't think it's good for the United States. But I also don't think it's good for Saudi Arabia. And based on all my experience and years in government, while I understand all the macroeconomic factors and energy market factors that Larry and Bernie are pointing to on why this was a sensible and rational decision by Saudi Arabia to make for its own interests and the interests of a stable and predictable supply and price of oil, and they didn't want to be swayed by the electoral interests of the Biden administration. I can't help but believe that in a different time in the U.S.-Saudi relationship, the kind of conversations we would have been having around this issue would have been different. And they could indeed, at the margins, have importantly affected the way this issue has now moved forward into what looks like we're headed into a genuine crisis in the strategic relationship, potentially, if more statesman-like views and behaviors don't somehow prevail to lift us above this downward cycle. So I think, while yes, the economics of this all explain a lot, I think at the nub of this, at the core of it, is a toxic, poisonous U.S.-Saudi relationship that has been building for some time. It's been really fueled by the Biden administration's approach on this issue, and ultimately a sense by the Saudis that they were on a target list for this administration, that they just didn't like the Saudis. They wanted to fundamentally change the relationship, and the manifestation of that in this desperate effort to revive the Iran nuclear deal, to hand over tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia's worst enemy, a sense that the United States was leaving the region, abandoning the Saudis and our traditional partners in the Gulf to the tender mercies of the Ayatollahs in Iran, that the fundamentals, the foundational principle of the oil for security bargain between the United States and Saudi Arabia, you know, that the Saudis saw the security element as starting to break down. And therefore, their calculations on the energy front are going to be affected by that when the Americans come calling and pleading, oh, you've got to help us by, you know, producing more oil or helping us drive down the price. Because let's face it, the Saudis may be doing something rational, but we are facing, you know, a genuine challenge to the world order, an American-led world order and primacy in Ukraine in terms of this Russian aggression, a Russian power that has invaded and attempted to destroy a sovereign member of the United Nations, that is now threatening the world with the use of nuclear weapons for the first time in 80 years. I can tell you that 20 years ago, in that context, when this kind of challenge to an American-led world order and American primacy in the international system, and American power, that the Saudis have a deep and abiding interest in the survival of their country and their regime, and in this American order and American power and American primacy, because the Russians and Chinese certainly are not going to provide it ultimately when the Saudis are in the sights of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. That the breakdown of that sense that the United States will have their back, I think, has colored all of this in a very, very negative way. And while I thought it still may be salvageable in July, I think now that it's reached this point, however rational economically it may be, I think it is now, for at least the next couple of years, it will be very hard to repair this. I don't know where the guardrails are now. I don't imagine that a bunch of Republican populists coming into Congress after the November elections, when they're confronted with a lot of crazy ideas by Democrats to punish the Saudis, that you're going to find a lot of Republicans saying, okay, I'm going to take a hard vote and defend the U.S.-Saudi strategic partnership here because it's absolutely essential to American national interest. They'll fight like hell for you know, greater U.S. oil and gas production, which I think is absolutely essential. And Larry can talk about what the Biden administration has done to suppress that in an absolutely crazy way, while demanding that all of these authoritarian regimes all over the world produce more, while we're not going to encourage production here at home. It's simply absolutely crazy to put us more at the beck and call of these foreign powers, who obviously have their own economic interests, if not their own strategic interests, that run contrary to American interests. So I'll just stop there, but I do think there is this core of a deeply, deeply troubled and getting more troublesome U.S.-Saudi strategic partnership here that we have to be really worried about.
Seems like other countries are pursuing their economic and strategic interests, but our domestic energy policy suggests that we're doing just the opposite. Larry, you wanted to add some on that, and then I'll go to the
Well,
Professor Heichel.
Yes, we have to understand that countries operate in their self-interest. Germany is a perfect example. One for all for one, as long as that one is Germany. We've seen what they've done with their nuclear units. In 2021, they closed 3 of their last 6 nuclear units. They were begged not to do it. They have 3 more now. They've been on and off for what they would do with them. They're suggesting they might have 2 of them on standby, but the Germans look out for their self-interest. The Saudis are looking out for their self-interest. This was not a targeted policy designed to get the US. It was designed to get the US off this really potentially dangerous concept of this cap. We don't know whether it'll work or not. What we do know, and you have to take him seriously because he showed you how serious he was with natural gas, is Putin's statement that any country that complies with the cap will not get any oil, which means the Russians will cut production at a time when you do not have the ability to make that volume up. Janet Yellen and the United States are playing with fire. They know that. They were told that. They are totally ignoring it. That is the reason behind what the Saudis did. And we only have to understand that the right will interpret this as a failed Biden policy in the Middle East. They'll play it as hard as they can politically to the midterms. The left will play it as the Saudis and OPEC responsible for gasoline price increases, not us. Don't blame us. And it's going to play out in the context of politics, not the reality of what really is going on. In January, the Saudi production was close to 10 million barrels a day. In October, it was 11. Their production went up almost 1 million barrels a day. No one has mentioned that. The administration talks about the US producers not doing anything. Their production will be up 6, 7, 800,000 barrels a day this year. And the EIA is forecasting another 800,000 barrels a day next year. That didn't come by magic. That didn't come out of the air. It came by drilling, even with limited access to permits. And the fact that the administration continues to refuse to put new acreage out there for the industry to bid on.
Yeah. All right, Professor, we only have a few more minutes left, and then go ahead. You had something you wanted to add before? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to talk about Saudi spare capacity, but Larry mentioned it. I would just add that you know, the Democrats have gone after Saudi Arabia for quite some time now, both by wanting to open up to Iran, but also by targeting specifically the internal workings of succession within the kingdom. I mean, the Crown Prince, who's now Prime Minister, was in the sights of the Democrats, but also former members of the CIA who felt that their asset had been displaced by MBS. This is the previous Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Naif. And so the Americans have turned this into a very personal matter, and they've also targeted, for the first time, as far as I can tell, an individual in the hierarchy of the Saudi leadership for replacement by someone else from the royal family. That again is unprecedented, and it's disrespectful. And I'm not sure where that comes from. I mean, just compare, for instance, the coverage of the Jamal Khashoggi murder, which went on for months in the Washington Post, New York Times, with the attempted murder on Salman Rushdie recently, who was the person who tried to kill Salman Rushdie is an Iranian agent. It's clearly someone from Hezbollah, from Lebanon, but there's just no mention of it at all. Now, here's an American citizen, Salman Rushdie is an American citizen living in America. Someone tried to kill him with state sponsorship, that of Iran, and it's just not mentioned. So, the Saudis see all of this and they say, like, what gives? What is in it, for us? Like, why are the Americans like this? And frankly, I find it very hard to explain, other than, some form of racism, some sort of anti-Arab, anti-Saudi, anti-Muslim thing. I can't explain why the hatred for Saudi Arabia, which is so persistent. I mean, some of it is, of course, funded by other states in the Gulf who have been opposed to the Saudis, like the Qataris, who spent a lot of money in DC, also Turkey, and so on. But the way in which the United States, especially the Democrats, have treated the kingdom is going to come to haunt us because we need them, whether we like it or not. We need them for global oil stability and global market stability.
We only have a few minutes left, so John, let me conclude with you. Just on the professor's point, I wondered if Masha Amini, the 22-year-old Kurdish woman who was killed in mid-September that helped set off these protests, was a Washington Post columnist, or that Nika, I forget how to pronounce her last name, the teenage woman who was just been discovered to have been also tortured and killed in these protests by the Iranians. If she was the same thing, if you'd see a little more fervor, at least on the left side of actually on either side of the political spectrum, but particularly on the left, in support of these demonstrators. How do you think, U.S. policy to Iran, even about these demonstrations, which has impacted the Saudi perception of the U.S. towards the region?
Like I said, I think it's been quite harmful and destructive of any degree of really healthy trust in the U.S.-Saudi strategic relationship. I now think both of them are increasingly eyeing that this relationship could be broken. The fact that Biden went to Saudi Arabia allegedly to try and repair and rebuild some level of trust and relationship with the leadership. And then within a few weeks, he was back in Washington, and Rob Malley was again throughout the entire month of August trying to revive the Iran nuclear deal and offer more concessions to Iran and the Revolutionary Guard to give them economic carve-outs. I think was a signal to the Saudis that none of this was serious. They're the most cynical interpretation that it was all about a temporary increase in oil production and getting prices down so Biden could, the Democrats could win the midterm elections, which I don't, agree at all. I see a big superpower play. I see a big Russia-Ukraine play here. I see the stability of the global economy at issues. People can disagree on what needs to be done in terms of the oil markets right now, but I just think the absolute lack of trust in between the United States and Saudi Arabia now has almost predetermined that the Saudis are going to be looking to say, why should we take a hit for the United States anymore? Because America just is simply not there to have our backs. We can't rely on it, and we certainly can't piss off the Russians and Chinese. We can't afford to do that. There's got to be all kinds of behavior that are much more mercantilist and strictly in their own national interest, without regard to the fact that for more than 75 years, their security has been guaranteed by the United States and by American power and American leadership and primacy in the international system that served Saudi Arabia quite well and the United States quite well. But I just have a sense that that's beginning to unravel. It's very, very dangerous, and I don't see statesmen on either side now. I don't think you can do it with this current administration anymore, certainly not with the national security lineup he has. I don't think Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken can go with a straight face and figure out a way, even if they were inclined to begin repairing the trust and confidence in this relationship on the Saudi side for some of the reasons Bernie described about just how distrustful and suspicious the Saudis are now about U.S. intentions.
Okay, well, look, I want to conclude there on a very upbeat note, and I want to thank Larry and Professor Heichel and John and all of you for joining us, and just please look out. We're going to, obviously, this is an important issue for us. U.S. security interests in the region, our ties with the Saudis and other of our close allies in the region. So look out for more written product from JINSA on this and more such webinars. So thank you very much for joining us. I wish everybody a good weekend. So thank you all. Thanks.